Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University. Today I'm with Jenny Amann, Katie Cross and Mark Doidge, and we're going to talk about sport for climate action and nature. We'll discuss mobilising football fans to take action on climate change with a specific focus on Pledgeball before we look at the future of climate change research and action. Hello everyone. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you, B. I know everybody's really busy with lots of things going on. I know we've got the SCAN symposium at Loughborough, and I know there's Green Football Weekend that people are working on. So massively appreciate you guys being here. What we like to do before we get started is to give a bit of context to our listeners and a bit of an introduction so they know who they're listening to. So would it be okay for you guys to give us a brief introduction? Jenny, do you want to start in and give us an introduction yourself?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for the invite first, Martin. I'm Jenny. I'm now a PhD student at Loughborough University, trying to understand how football can be utilized to increase the acceptance and the demand for climate action and deeper social changes needed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In 2020, I think, during my master's degree in global studies, I did a research internship with Mark Doidge, and since then I have been working more intensively on this topic.
Excellent, thank you. Katie, can you introduce yourself, please?
Of course. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Martin. I'm Katie. I'm the founder and CEO of the charity Pledgeball. And I met Jenny and Mark really through starting this up initially through the wonderful club that is White Hawk, based in Brighton. But I guess we'll come more onto that later.
We certainly will. And Mark, do you want to give us a brief introduction to yourself, please?
Oh yeah, thanks Martin, and thanks for inviting me as well. So I'm a sociologist in the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough. I'm interested in a variety of areas around football fandom in particular, but sport and how we can use it for social benefit, and more recently around sustainability and climate action. Hence why we're A, organising the symposium, but B, how I got involved with Pledgeball, because I had a very random conversation with Katie that came about, and the rest is history, as they say.
Excellent. Well, I think we're going to learn about that history in this podcast. So you've teed me up perfectly for that. Just for our audience or potential new audience, this is actually the third podcast that we've done on sustainability, and we're certainly going to have more moving forward in the future. In our previous podcast, we talked with Dr. Russell Seymour and Elliot Brown, and we focus more around the issues surrounding climate change. So if you've not heard that one already, it's episode 62. But today we're going to focus more around mobilising football fans to take action on climate change. So can we get started there by you guys telling us why you engage with football fans to take action in this space? And Katie, can we start with yourself?
Yeah, of course. I mean, this starts from a very amateur, I guess, story. There was no science behind it at all. It really came about because having taught climate change for years, I was a secondary school biology teacher. It had almost become something that I just wasn't engaged with. I taught it, but I didn't think it was happening here and now. And then when I realised really the situation we were in, it was that choice, I think, between despair and taking action. So I started doing some volunteering with Extinction Rebellion. And from there, obviously, you see people's automatic knee-jerk responses on the streets. Even though if you boil the questions of climate change down to questions that are very simple, do you want clean air to breathe? Do green spaces matter to you? Do you want to preserve, the current food systems in a way that is affordable? The answer is obviously yes, but it's framed in such a way, and the associations with climate activism are such that loads of people feel alienated. So from there, I started researching what we as a family could do. And then I shared that with my grassroots football team. Not really sure how they'd respond. I was fairly new to the team. It was a squad of about 45 women from all different walks of life. And I just shared with them the impact that we'd have as a collective taking action. And their response was so positive and so questioning that some of them volunteered to set up a grassroots tournament with me. It was a men's and women's grassroots tournament. The only entry fee was to make a pledge, and then we awarded the team of fans that pledged to save the most emissions, as well as the team that had won the tournament. We had free food because we'd sourced a load of waste food from restaurants. We had free bike servicing, etc. And just the kind of conversations that were happening on that day, and it was pretty big in the end. I think there were 20 teams involved. It was really encouraging, and from there we took it to what was then virtual, the Sport Positive Summit. Met a lot of people working in professional sports, and there was such interest in this space and what we did that it went from there. And that's then subsequently where we launched with Whitehawk. But really, because this had been something that we'd just come up with, that was when I immediately wanted to check that what we were doing actually worked, which is why I then approached Mark to help me to design a piece of impact assessment really around it. And then it kind of goes on from there. So Mark, I don't know if you want to take over at this point, but obviously this is when you then opened this up to Jenny, and who jumped in there.
It's a great segue to Mark. Can I just ask a couple of quick questions on that? So you mentioned where it all began and where it started. So what is Pledgeball now? Because obviously I've been on your website and seen where it's at. So what is Pledgeball now, and how do people get involved?
Yeah, good question. So very simply, it's a research-backed charity that engages, and it's actually not only football fans, but we primarily focus on football, but sports fans and players around climate and sustainability. The aim being that you shift people's perspectives away from this paralysis they feel in the face of climate, this cognitive dissonance, because they feel as though they can't have an impact, to a place where they feel empowered to take action because they realise they can take action, and that they can have an impact, particularly as part of this existing collective, but also where they feel closer to climate action. They don't see it as a preserve environmentalists. So the way that people can get involved is firstly through supporting their professional football clubs. So we have a league table that runs throughout the football season, and fans compete against each other to top that Pledgeball league. The more emissions you pledge to save for a fixture, the higher your club climbs up the league table. But in order to push them higher, you have to get more people involved. You have to maybe take on new challenges and new pledges. And so it carries on like that. And we push this out during the football fixtures. So it's not extraneous to that with which people are already engaged. It's simply part of that match day. Clubs push it out for us. We work very closely with supporters groups. We're partnered with the Football Supporters Association. And so that's how fans get involved. The other way in which people can get involved is through essentially hosting their own tournaments. So they can actually have a listing on the Pledgeball website, just like we did in that first grassroots instance. And we have a load of other sports who use that facility as well.
Excellent. Great depth there. Just a quick challenge to you. Who's top of the league at the moment?
Oh, goodness. Actually, I tell you what, as of yesterday, it's Norwich.
Yes, well done. I'm on it right now. And probably unsurprisingly, Forest Green Rovers are second, although maybe you'd expect them to be top.
I think what you might be seeing right now, though, is the Green Football Weekend reskin. Because
is it? Oh, you're right. You are right.
So we have the reskin, and that will be the Green Football Weekend Cup. So this is a kind of standalone couple of weeks. But Norwich, I think, are also top of the Pledgeball League only as of yesterday. They've just overtaken Charlton. My
other question, and I might be wrong on this because I did have a look. I seem to be disappointed because I couldn't find Nottingham Forest on it. Are we not on it? Are we not?
I don't think so.
Any Forest friends need to get involved. Okay.
It's a good job the City Ground isn't close to the river and might get flooded like Nottingham Rugby just next door to it. So, yeah.
Yes, it did. The rugby club got extremely flooded and the Trent was very high only a week ago. So, yes, putting it out there, Forest need to get involved. I don't think there's any clubs from Nottingham when I actually looked. And I know numerous ones at Notts County and Mansfield Town. So all of you lot get involved. Anyway, you segued very nicely into Mark. So, Mark, over to you.
This is one of those sort of serendipitous moments in one's academic career where basically because you're engaged in a particular group, piece of research or particular groups of fans or sort of community groups, that somehow the ideas sort of come to you. I know when I've finished my PhD, I was like, where's the ideas going to come from? And then luckily there's people like Katie out there who have great ideas and then come to you. And this all came about because, as was mentioned earlier, I was when I was living in Brighton, I was a season ticket holder at Whitehawk, and on in the 7th, 8th tier of English football, and a fairly active group of fans, particularly in community engagement. So raising money for charities, supporting refugees, anti-racist and anti-homophobic and anti-sexist chants, but also collecting for the local food bank and the local community. So I was just engaged in that as a fan more than anything. But my background research was around football fans and sort of social engagement. So that'd been around anti-racism or fighting to keep your club or working with refugees or anti-hate crime, different projects at different stages. And because I'd been at Whitehawk, Katie had actually emailed the local Green councillors because the Greens had been a minority controlled in Brighton. And one of those Green councillors was also a fan of Whitehawk. And he said, oh, you should speak to Mark, and then forwarded my email on. The weird thing is that 2 days previously, someone else had emailed me completely independently asking, how would we engage football fans around climate change? And this was during COVID when we had a slightly different existential crisis. And I'm going, oh, this is actually something quite motivating to get my teeth into. I've had a long history of being in and around sort of the green environmental movement. And sport is a great space for this. One of my first forms of activism was just being part of Surfers Against Sewage back in Devon. And my other form of activism was protesting against my owner of the club that I grew up supporting, Plymouth Argyle. So this was an opportunity to combine both of them. And the conversation, with two different people in a space of 3 days asking me about this meant, why aren't we doing something about this? And that sort of opened up a whole series of questions in my own mind. The academic entrepreneur was like, there's a gap here, a massive gap. And luckily, Katie allowed me to exploit it. At the same time, I was having a conversation with Jenny, who had approached me about a sport for development project I was part of, an Erasmus Plus project, and wanting to do an internship with me. She was currently then based in Sweden, and how to do an internal one. And as an aside, she sort of mentioned, oh, well, I can pass this over to her because she can tell it better, that her club in Germany was interested in climate, green activism. And I went, oh, there's this person. Katie had mentioned something to me, and I will now pass over to Jenny to sort of add the colour to the rest of that story.
Excellent way of using football to pass over to Jenny. So Jenny, over to you.
Yeah, well, I mean, what is there left to say? Yeah, as Mark just mentioned, I approached him because, well, during COVID, it was quite unlikely to get like a normal internship. And as part of my master's course, an internship was required. So at some point, they just came up with those research internships. And I thought, okay, there's research internships in Gothenburg. Maybe I can also do one in Brighton. So eventually I was able to convince Mark that this is a good idea. And he told me about like Katie approaching him, telling him about, told me about Pledgeball. And I mean, doing a degree in global studies, I think, I also had like a focus on, well, sustainable development. So I did have that interest in environmental stuff and climate change, trying to tackle climate change already. And back in 2018, actually, I did an editorial internship where I looked into German professional football clubs' ecological commitment, which back then wasn't, well, that big as it is now, maybe. I mean, obviously, there's still room for improvement, but it's definitely more common to do something around the environment now. But so I think when Mark said like football fans, climate change, was like, yeah, let's do it. Sounds really interesting, and particularly knowing that, well, research today suggests that the way how climate change has been discussed or is still discussed predominantly is not necessarily helpful in terms of getting people on board. And there's now a challenge to find innovative ways to reach out, especially to people that are not reached by the messages of traditional environmental movements. And that can be done by finding smart ways to link complex issues to people's everyday lives, their values, something that they actually do care about. And for many people across the world, this is football. Like according to FIFA, I think it is around 3.5 billion now. And I'm sure Katie is going to say more about the impact that the football fan community can have when it comes to tackling climate change. But yeah, I mean, football is still one of the few phenomena where such a large group of people comes together on a regular basis to support their team. And as, for example, also Mark's research shows, football fans have proven to be an area for mobilization. And obviously being a football fan myself helps to kind of get excited about this topic as well. But yes, I think it just really made sense in a way. Yeah.
A really nice summary that you've made there. And obviously some important points there, such as you're a football fan. So who do you support?
I'm supporting the best club in Germany, Werder Bremen.
Okay.
They might not be top of the Bundesliga at the moment, but like in terms of their social commitment and everything, it's a great club.
And at least like Argyle, they wear green. That's the main thing. They wear green. I
was just going to ask Mark. So you're an Argyle fan, so you're not Brighton, you're not Whitehawk, although you like them. You're an Argyle fan.
No, I'm a Whitehawk fan, but being up in Nottingham now, it's a bit harder to follow Whitehawk on a regular matchday experience. And Plymouth Argyle are more likely to come closer to here, as they did at the weekend in Huddersfield. So yeah, it's a bit easier to see them now.
Fair enough. You can start supporting Loughborough instead. And Katie, are you a football fan as well?
I am, but I've been quite secret about who I support up until fairly recently.
Are we going to put it out there? Who is it?
I'll taunt me. Well, let's just say we had a very good Tuesday night in the FA Cup against a particular Premier League team.
Okay, is that Bristol then?
You can't just say Bristol.
Bristol.
Yeah,
there's two Bristol clubs.
Was it Bristol City or Rovers? Because we're playing you next, then, aren't we?
You are, yeah. That's what I thought when you said Forest.
So, no, apologies. Is it Bristol City or Bristol Rovers? I haven't taken much note of the FA Cup, to be honest.
Rovers unfortunately lost to Norwich last night in the FA Cup.
Yeah.
But yes, it was City who, let's say, just riled West Ham slightly.
Yeah, you're apparently quite good at home as well, aren't you? From what I've briefly heard. So yeah, well, watch this space in the future. Well, thank you. I'm sure listeners are very, impressed with listening to who we support in football. But I suppose more importantly, we're here to talk about mobilising football fans and climate change. I really love it when we do get people together that really hit the nail on the head for the podcast, because the podcast is here to look at bridging the gap between academia and professional practice. And we've got, a very knowledgeable, experienced researcher, a PhD student, and somebody who's taken action, and we're combining that together to discuss that in the podcast. So we're perfectly well placed. We've had a brief introduction of what Pledgeball is. So question to you, Mark, how does Pledgeball attempt to mobilise football fans into making climate-related behavioural changes?
Well, the key part of Pledgeball is about making those regular pledges to say you're going to do something that will help tackle climate change. And it's about transferring that individual action into a collective action, and that the trick is, and the difficulty, and that's something we want to work on in the future, is how to translate someone making a pledge. And the joke that we always had when we were talking with Whitehawk fans about how do we prove this is, one of the pledges is about having a shorter shower. How do we prove that? Unless we go and join them in the shower, which we don't intend to do as ethically minded researchers, but we are relying on people to put that forward. But part of this, and one of the things that Katie is sort of keen to do, and one of the reasons why football and sport are good mechanisms to do this, is because it's regular. We know that there's a football fixture list. We've just talked about the FA Cup, and we've just we can talk about the league, and we know when those fixtures are. And football fans are quite ritualistic, because we'll go to the game every other weekend. We'll go and maybe even go to the same pub or the same burger van before a game. We'll be meeting to the same people, talking to the same people, and engaging this in a certain way. So what we want, and what the idea is that you do this on a regular basis, and eventually you start to go, actually, maybe I should be doing this. Even if you're just pledging and just doing it maybe to get your club some the Pledgeball League and looking like they're beating their rivals, actually over time you might start to reflect, and even just sometimes putting the pledges and actually seeing a pledge that you might not have thought about before is something that you can do. And I know myself, when I started doing it, it was things like washing at 30 degrees, for example, doing my washing at 30 degrees, suddenly realised, that could have an impact. And it wasn't something I was necessarily aware of, even though I thought I was hitting lots of things on there, because I was doing that anyway. So I think it's part of that is, showing people that there are different things that we can do. B, asking you to do it on a regular basis to fit in, as Katie said earlier, about fitting in with your regular match day experience. And sort of from that, those ideas embedding themselves into your routine, and then thinking, actually, this might be something that I should actually be doing, or just questioning other people when they're, you know, eating a certain thing or traveling in a certain way or wearing a certain type of clothing.
You've touched upon a few things there that I've seen in your research around social norms and challenging those social norms and educating people. I think one of the pieces that I read said, there's a quote from somebody saying, I can't do anything about it on my own, so I don't bother. And I think you just alluding there to the social change within small groups, within individuals, to then potentially grow it into something further. One of the things I did want to ask you, Katie, was, can you give us some examples of the types of pledge? I know Mark's mentioned a couple there, but what are the most popular ones that people take on?
Yeah, definitely. And what you've said actually perfectly feeds into what I was about to say. So in answer to that question first, so the pledges range from switching to using reusable water bottle, as simple as that, to higher impact ones like eating plant-based. Very nice. I'm just for those who can't currently see the screen, I've just been showcased a lovely reusable water bottle. To eating plant-based 2 days a week, to installing solar panels. So the idea being that it's fully accessible. Now, what I was going to say, and this, I mean, social norms will certainly come into it, is I think it makes sense to answer this by stepping back for a start and saying, well, what do we need to do in order to tackle climate change? We don't just need individual change, but we certainly need it. We're working very closely with a leading researcher called Lorraine Whitmarsh. And, one of the things that the CAST team, or the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations, produced in September was a paper that very clearly argued that a public engagement strategy was absolutely crucial if we are to reach our net zero targets. And not because you need individual behaviour change in isolation, but you do need individual behaviour change, but partly because that entirely feeds into systemic change. We're not going to get the rapid transition in infrastructure that we need to see without demand being made. But if I went to people and said, I'd like you to make very clear by standing on the street with me, or by writing to your council, or voting differently, that you care about climate, that's not going to happen, because for a couple of reasons. One is, as I mentioned earlier, this paralysis that people feel, this feeling that they can't have an impact. The second being that they think that taking climate action is to preserve environmentalists. So what Pledgeball does is engage people and shift that mindset, really illustrating that as a collective, we can have an impact with whatever we feel comfortable with. So whether it's starting with those individual smaller pledges, or whether it's actually using your voice. And essentially, Pledgeball takes you on that journey from the small, lower impact changes, as Mark mentioned, and as Jenny's research showed, increasing that awareness around impact and the different choices that you can have that then have an impact, to then feeling sufficiently empowered and comfortable to act as an ambassador and use your voice. And, we work very closely with Climate Outreach, who work on exactly this and are experts in engaging people on climate, and very clearly talk about the linkage between systemic and infrastructural change. And that's really what Pledgeball aims to do. And I'm sure Jenny can build upon this. It's not a behaviour change campaign. Behaviour change campaigns tend to traditionally focus on certain key behaviours. And there are certain issues with that. One being that people sometimes subconsciously offset those behaviours. So if you focus on a few key behaviours, they'll, subconsciously think, oh, well, I've done that. In the same way that, if you maybe are dieting, you might, or exercising, you might think, oh, I can eat a bit more over here. But the other thing being that it doesn't affect people's intrinsic beliefs and values, and so they're not very resilient. So, for example, if you've had a behaviour change campaign focused on cycling, it might be that actually people uptake cycling for a while, but as soon as the weather gets bad or you get a puncture, it's slightly more difficult, and therefore that doesn't continue. So what Pledgeball really aims to do is focus on, and I put in quotations, transformation. And Jenny will probably butt in because I'll completely misrepresent this. I know this term is completely misused, but that's what it aims to do, and then ultimately shift behaviours through that process.
Can I jump in? Because I think there's also, this is why sport and football in particular are really important, because what Katie's alluded to there is actually what we need is structural change. What we do need is big business, governments to make change. But we also are in a world of populism, where governments are saying, oh no, this is what the people want, and unless the people rise up and say something, they're not going to do something. And football is exactly, it's quite a similar space. Is the changes that have taken place in football have not necessarily come from, say, the progressive changes in football haven't come from the clubs or the FAs or the football federations or the leagues. They've come from the fans, because there have been transformations in football. There's the big transformation of the Premier League. There's the big transformation of the Champions League, which have massively increased the revenues of those leagues. And that has massively increased the revenues of those clubs. So that's what I mean. Structural change makes a big difference to a small number of people. But actually, lots of fans have also mobilised against that. So what's happened since 1992 is there's been over 100 clubs that's nearly gone bankrupt or nearly gone out of business. Fans have created supporters trusts and support associations to campaign to keep their clubs going, to resist some of these changes. A couple of years ago, the Super League was going to be formed, and fans stopped and sort of mobilised against that and stopped it. And similarly, the changes that have taken place in and around racism and other forms of discrimination in the game haven't come from, a nice, lovely club president who says, oh, this is the right thing to do. It's come from players and from a certain group of fans pushing back on this and saying this isn't acceptable. So equally, in the same sort of space and the same sort of movement around the environment, it's about the people saying we need to actually do something about this. And the problem is that all the research shows, and there's a very good psychological reason for this, is it is so big. It's so complex and so difficult that it makes us feel very small and insignificant. And the danger is that, and my fear as well within the sports space, is that the blame will be put on fans, and that they are the ones that need to do something about it, when actually it's the clubs and the federations, and more importantly, the governments that should be doing it. But it is also a natural thing. It's like, well, this is too big and scary, I'll shut it out. People, the example I always use is that people living in Naples know that Vesuvius might go off at some point and do another Pompeii. But if you could constantly fearful of that, you wouldn't live your life. And again, the more brutal one is, we all know we're going to die, but if we spend our every waking moment thinking we're going to die, we're never going to live. And that's the same thing about climate change. It's so big and scary that actually lots of people just say, I don't know what to do, I'll switch it off. But actually, that's the worst thing that can happen, because governments won't do anything about it, and the actions that are required just means that the greenhouse gases continue, the world continues to heat up, floods will become more prevalent, snow melts, etc., which will impact us. And by the time we realise, oh, this is a problem, it's probably too late. So what Pledgeball does, and what Katie was saying, is highlighting that these little things that we can do, but equally we can do this collectively. And then also that consciousness raise, and to say, well, actually, maybe I should care about the environment around my football ground. I don't want it to be messy and horrible or polluted. I want it to be a nice world. I want our football players to be able to compete in a world where they're not overheating, or particularly in grassroots football or grassroots sports. I want to watch my team, but I can't watch it because it's regularly flooded. And that's something that will happen with lots of sports clubs, because floodplains tend to be quite flat, which are perfect for sport pitches. But that also means, as it says on the tin, they're floodplains. They flood. And that, if there's more water in the atmosphere, that will come down, meaning more floods, meaning we have less sport. And actually, there's actually a reason for us to do this. So getting us thinking about that, making those connections to something our local community and things we care about, like sport, then maybe we can then start pushing our politicians to do what they need to do. And we've seen that with football trusts and with anti-racism initiatives, etc., in football and in other sports. We can do this.
You've summarised that really nicely as, utilising football fans as agents of change. And I think that's stealing language from some of your research, to be honest, Mark. And I had here, like, empowering football fans to be the leaders of change instead of thinking they're powerless. And Pledgeball seems like a great tool to educate in one element, to make you have that deeper understanding of, well, what changes and what things can I do to make change? And then ideally growing that movement from you as an individual to you as your circle of influence and your friends group, to then your club, to then, bigger movements within football. Again, just some of your other research that I've looked at before, I think you talked about some of the ultras that you've done research on, and how actually, yes, we've all got rivals, but at times and at big times and big problems, you often come together. I think you mentioned something about flooding in Italy, where two ultras teams, actually the ultras of each of those sides came together. Could you just give us that example, and then we'll move on, because I really like that.
I think this is one of the intrinsic paradoxes of football fandom and sport in general, which is it's intrinsically competitive and about rivalries, but you actually also need to cooperate to put on a league and to put on a cup competition, and you need to cooperate. And equally, the beauty of sport is that on one hand, you're both doing a shared activity, so both coming together to play a cricket match or to play a football match, but equally, you're also heavily divided, particularly at the end of the match when there's a winner and a loser. So you're both doing the same thing, but also completely divided. And rivalries are an intrinsic part of sport, and football in particular. But equally, it's about coming together, recognizing those shared issues. And again, this is why I think football fans are really important agent of change here. And to link that back to the history of football fan activism is, football fans might compete. But what happened in the 90s is there was suddenly a realization that, hang on, that thing that's happening to that other club could actually be happening to us. Brighton Hove Albion were a great example of this, in that their owner at the time, Bill Archer, wanted to, didn't want to, he did, he sold the ground and then moved them to Gillingham, 50 miles away, with horrendous access from Brighton. But fans of other clubs, it was actually a Plymouth Argyle fan, came up with the idea of having Fans United. Lots of fans of different clubs come into Brighton Hove Albion and supporting them and recognising that actually this could happen to us. And that is sort of what's happening, is that's the birth of the Football Supporters Association, recognising there are shared difficulties and structural problems in the game. Now, in some cases, those fans in Germany's pretty good at doing this, and in other countries as well. And you do have national federations. Ironically, Italy's probably not the best one. Some of those rivalries are really entrenched where they won't work together. But equally, football fans are those people who do care about their community. Football clubs invariably are named after a part of a city, or the city itself, or maybe even the region. Fans intrinsically identify with that region. So even if you're not from Manchester, people who are Manchester United fans or Manchester City fans have an affinity to that city. And this happens around the world. So when something happens, say a flood, and it happened in the Rhine in Germany, happened at a club that I did my PhD research with in Livorno, when there were floods, those fans, those ultras, came out and mobilised to help the cleanup operation, because they are a network of fans who are coming together every week to support a club. So when there's another issue, then actually they can mobilise to support that, as fans have done in this country around food banks. They know that every Saturday we're playing a game, let's support our local community. It's not necessarily about football, but it's about our community and the people around it. And that's what we're trying to do here is, the climate change is going to affect our communities, and often it's going to affect the most marginalized and the poorest in our communities, not just locally, but globally. And therefore, okay, how do we think about this in a slightly different way and think about us as football fans and what we can do to do something about it?
Trying to link back to a couple of points that Mark and Katie made, but I mean, it's this talking about floods, right? And pitches being flooded and everything. I think we're really missing an opportunity here, because also in general, like when we talk about flooding, and also in Germany, there has been, most Germany has been flooded, like just over Christmas, basically. We kind of miss making that connection between like extreme weather events and climate change. And that like doesn't happen in football either. What we do instead, and Mark mentioned that as well, is like blame it on fans. Like the entire discourse, or a very big part of the discourse around climate change in football is that 70 or more than 70% of emissions stem from fan travel. So the problem seems to be fans traveling to matches. But what we don't talk about is that, for example, UEFA then artificially expands their like international competitions, such as the Champions League recently, or all the dodgy sponsors that we have that are like basically sponsoring the competitions and also fueling the climate emergency. So there is definitely tendencies to see that, and we're not really making use of the opportunities that are out there as well. And then talking about climate is also not necessarily something that we just do for casual small talk. Like I think even like neither of us here in this conversation feels that comfortable about raising the issue with the football fan next to them in the stands. And that's where I think the research that we did was quite powerful around Pledgeball, because having this visibility of other fans taking action in form of the league table, it actually enabled conversations, and not just amongst fans. Like they started having conversations in their WhatsApp group, like just asking for vegan recipe ideas. And like, I don't know, just on Saturdays we're like, okay, what have you pledged? Have you made your pledge? Like, what did you do? And they just started sharing their experience and just helping themselves overcome some of the barriers that you face when you try to live a more environmentally friendly life. But it also helped having conversations with the club. So the club actually saw, hey, it's not just one individual fan who thinks it's important to talk about climate or to do something around climate change. It's more fans. And then with Whitehawk, for example, they started to talk with the local public transport company, for example, to make it easier to get to the ground using public transport. They talked about having recyclable cups on match days, having recycling bins, like all these kind of things were a result of it just being more visible that there is demand. And it goes back to what Katie said as well. You don't necessarily want to be seen as the climate activist or something, but with this league table, it's not like you, it kind of creates this, okay, it's a we are a collective and we demand change. And that was, just very powerful to see what kind of impact that had with fans.
The conversations that fans have are very powerful, but they can disrupt, or they can just reinforce the norms. And I think this is one of the key areas, and I think something for future research really is how do we have an influence over those conversations? Because I remember being told by a psychologist that there was a piece of research about floods in Boscastle and in Cornwall, and the closer that the researchers got to Boscastle, the less likely they were to think it was climate change. And it was interesting because when the floods were in Britain over the last couple of weeks, I sort of had a look on social media, and I noticed a conversation, and this isn't to sort of pull out or to criticize the fans of this club, but it was talking about Shrewsbury Town, for example, and there were floods in the river there, but then equally what I saw in the conversation was, well, the old Gay Meadow, which was right next to the river, used to flood all the time, and it happened quite regularly. So as you can see, is once you get closer to the club or to the community, there will be specific local issues or local history or local knowledge that might actually be used to say, well, actually, it's always flooded. But actually, what we really need is the research to say, well, actually, yes, it did flood, but it flooded every 10 years. And actually, it's flooding every year now, or every 2 years. And that's the difference. And it's making that connection, because otherwise it's easy to dismiss and go, well, it's always flooded because it's a floodplain. But actually, if it's flooding more often, or the club is losing more money because of the flooding, or the type of flooding is changed, that's what we need the research in, not just making that very glib connection. Because obviously, if it is a floodplain, it's called a floodplain, it will have flooded. But it's whether it's changing and having those conversations with fans, rather than coming in and saying, Shrewsbury Town, you don't know what you're talking about. Go, well, actually, you do know what you're talking about. You have very specific knowledge. But actually, how do we work with that, with the additional research to think, okay, actually, maybe there's something changing here, and these are the connections, and therefore, if you care about your club, this is something we need to think about.
It's a good general, overall yet specific case study, provided there into how we can make change. And I think Jenny started to mention earlier about some of the specific research that you guys have done on Pledgeball. So I know that you have published some things, and I really like the title around, I hadn't realised that change is not a difficult thing, mobilising football fans on climate change. And I think this was the research that you specifically did on Pledgeball. So would you guys be able to talk us through what the research was and what your findings were?
Well, basically what we did, or the study had two main aims. And firstly, it was to find evidence for football fans being a promising, yet not considered collective when it comes to mobilizing an existing community to take climate action. And then secondly, as you rightly mentioned, it was to make sense of fans' attitudes towards climate change and climate action, but then basically using the pilot partnership between Pledgeball and the non-league club Whitehall in East Brighton to, find answers to that. And just because you already mentioned the title of the paper that we published, I think one of the most interesting things was that, we talked about the different pledges that you can make when engaging with Pledgeball. And it was actually that experimenting with these pro-environmental changes, it just shifted people's perceptions of change in a more general way. So they were actually, okay, it's not that difficult to change to recycle loo rolls. Is that how you pronounce it correctly? Or Katie's laughing, so that's reassuring. But it got people thinking. So even people who haven't actually registered their pledges online, just by looking at this list of different options, which ranged from, using a reusable cup to change to a green bank or stuff like this, made them think about things. And they understood that it can be quite enjoyable, especially when you do it as part of a bigger group. And it can be beneficial for yourself, for the broader football community, and also in that case for the environment. And it was more about this negative perception of change that we all have. We need to, move houses, we need to, start a new job, or just making decisions in front of a shelf in a supermarket. It's kind of daunting and it's not very pleasant. And so not just when we do think about environmental changes, but so we really found that when people started experimenting with those changes, they were like, oh, actually it's not that hard, or okay, going vegan, vegan dishes can actually taste quite well. So what else in my life haven't I tried to change just because I was afraid of the uncertainty around it in a way? So that was very powerful. But also going back to the more direct findings, and we had both environmental, I called them newcomers, I think, and already environmentally aware people that perceived making pledges in support of their team as a new, a motivating and a fun way to engage with the topic of climate change, but also, and I think that's very important, with each other. And I think Katie's happy with me saying this, but when I say pledges, I think I do have to clarify that Pledgeball strategy goes beyond just asking people to promise committing to more environmentally friendly behaviors, because the charity actually provides communication packages that include, for example, subtle reminders, drawing on the characteristics and regularity within football. And it then connects making those promises to the fixture calendar. And we mentioned the regularity before, basically draws on this element of competition, like asking fans to compete against other fans. And that was just something they haven't experienced before, which fans really resonated with. And I said that before, this aspect of visibility needs to be emphasized, because it really demonstrated to fans that other fans are concerned and take action as well. But also, and we said that before about this, others don't bother, so why should I? And quite often we don't really see into our neighbor's house, for example, or the conversations that people have, unless someone installs a solar panel on their roof. So this visibility in form of the league table just enabled conversations, as I mentioned before, the group chat, people asking for a substitute for cling film, vegan recipes, all these kind of things. And fans perceive their fan group as a safe space to ask those questions, So quite often when you talk to someone who's very well educated, I say, on climate and like behaving in an environmentally friendly way, you're kind of, and I feel like that quite often, like kind of scared of, just asking, okay, but if I can't have dairy anymore, like what else is there? Or, having these kind of conversations, they felt safe to have them there. We mentioned the element of verification before, and that Pledgeball has deliberately decided against it because there's also research suggesting that this is a major barrier, especially for people who do not yet identify strongly with the topic. So letting people voluntarily choose the change they want to make, and then making those impacts visible, supporting people while experimenting with those changes is very important. And yeah, as I said before, doing it for the team has been found to provide for some people a good enough excuse to actually start experimenting. And yeah, the impacts of climate change on football, they are not necessarily that visible. So even environmentally very aware fans, they mentioned that you only need a pitch and a ball to be able to play football. And it didn't really see that football is experienced negatively, or the athlete's health, for example, as well. I mean, we had a very hot summer again. Now the pitches are flooded. So yeah, there is I think still some opportunity to talk a bit more about this. But yeah, I think this was, these were one of the major findings. I don't know if Katie wants to add to it, or Mark.
Well, I was going to add it about, the key thing is, I alluded to, one of the reasons I liked Whitehawk is they were very community orientated, and for the UK listeners, many people might be aware of Brighton as a particular stereotype of Brighton in the UK, of quite a liberal sort of anything goes sort of community. As I said, as I alluded, they had a minority Green council for a couple of years. So the fact, and it's the only city in the country that's had a Green MP. So one could argue that Brighton is a particular case study. It's a very unique case study, but actually there are very key findings that we can extrapolate from this, which is, one is, particularly for organisations like Katie and Pledgeball, is if you're going to engage with football fans, actually engage them as football fans and learn something about the club. Don't just go in and start talking at them or trying to suggest that they might need to be educated, because the chances are they probably know a little bit more about their club than you do. And so it's connect to their history and their community and what matters to them. The other thing is to actually talk to the fans themselves and engage the fans, because often in football, as I said, they are seen as an irritant. They are people to be regulated or controlled, as opposed to actually the people that keep the club going, especially when those clubs are facing collapse. They're the fans are the ones that step in to save the club and keep them going. But so talking with them, engaging with them, as Jenny said, doing it on their terms and in their way is the most important thing. And the third thing, which is can be generalizable beyond a club like Whitehawk, is the club actually does something. Because most fans will know that their club says they're going to do something and then don't do it. And we also can say the same thing about politicians and employers and all sorts. So if the fans ask for something and the club says it's listening, then it's important for the club to actually do that thing to show that it's been listening, so that the fans can see that actually the club's doing something about it. And that's what happened at Whitehall. So it becomes this virtuous circle where actually we know something about our club. We are being listened, we're speaking up for it, and the club's doing something about it. And those sort of principles should be quite universal for any club or any sports club, really. Is engage the people on their terms, speak to them, and then enact what they're actually asking for, and then you might get some action.
Thanks, Mark. It sounds like the research showed some really, really good findings there. How did you find the research, Katie? Did it have any impact for you?
A huge impact. I mean, to be frank, there's no way I'd continue to do this work unless what we were doing was answering the problem that I wanted to solve, essentially. We have to have a way of framing climate change in a way that is A, tangible, and B, really illustrates the impact we can have. I mean, we're in a dire situation when it comes to climate change, but then you could look at it in another way well, and some people would say there's so few people who've been engaged around it or been mobilised around it. But then you could turn that around and say, well, there are so few people who've been mobilised about it. So imagine if they were just mobilised. I mean, there's science that suggests that it takes just 25% of a group of people simply adopting a new social norm to reach an inflection point that then triggers a cultural shift. So by mobilising people to start to prioritise sustainability, there is huge potential to drive really radical change. The research for me meant that Pledgeball could continue, or that I would continue, because, up until May of last year, I was doing this on a voluntary basis. So it meant that I wanted to continue because it clearly worked. And actually since then, and going to Mark's point about the demographic of Brighton, since then we've had another thorough piece of impact assessment carried out with our work with Birmingham County FA, and we've worked with them and the grassroots clubs there for 2 seasons now. And again, I mean, it was a different methodology here, and the statistical analysis showed a really significant beneficial impact, both from an environmental and a social standpoint. So it definitely works. There's no doubt about that. And it means that I continue to have that drive, but also all of the findings mean that it constantly informs strategy. One of the key things that we always ensure is that we are constantly questioning everything that we do. So I have one-to-ones with Jenny to ensure that I never go off the rails or get distracted. But also we work with, other PhD students who are on our volunteer team, and we work with a number of universities who we basically provide master's dissertation project proposals to. And a lot of their master's students, including Loughborough actually, then carry out those particular projects to feed further into our strategy.
It's great that you demonstrated the impact that the research has had. And even if that is just kind of clarifying and verifying that your work is doing what it's intended to do, and you're showing those kind of additional changes and the development that have gone on from that confidence that's come from having the research behind, your ideas. That's brilliant. What do you see as is the next step for Pledgeball? You mentioned kind of getting a 25% change to kind of facilitate cultural change. Is that one of the things you're trying to lead to, and how might you get to that?
100%. So that's our ultimate vision. That's absolutely where we're aiming for. And what's quite nice, we're a charity, and so we are strictly governed by meeting those charitable objectives, which is absolutely that. So there are a few ways. Obviously, this breaks down into financial as well. But in terms of us driving forwards, I guess you could break it down into 2 main pillars. One is increasing outreach. So that at scale engagement, Pledgeball is incredibly scalable. And what's really nice about it, as Jenny touched upon earlier, is that the tool itself is intended simply to be used and to spark conversations within existing communities. So one of the, I would say, most effective ways in which we've seen fellow fans engaged is through the supporters trusts we've worked with. So, there's a group of Burnley supporters called the Sustainable Clarets. There's a group of, the Canaries Trust, the Norwich fans, Swindon Town Supporters Club, all of these supporters groups who use Pledgeball as a means of encouraging others to take action amongst their peers, and therefore spark conversation that way. Because of that, because of the resonance they already have within the community, we see significant uptake there. Same with Huddersfield Town Supporters Association. The other side, of course, is continuing with the research to continue to ensure that we are engaging and supporting people on this journey from, making sustainable choices themselves to using their voice in the most effective way possible. So we're developing that through continuing to work with researchers to ensure that we can set up these means of support, whether that's online communities to facilitate, as Jenny said, those safe spaces in which people can talk about the changes they're making, talk about climate change, go through that almost grief process from realizing what you're facing to then spurring them into action, to, offline community groups meeting, to, potentially individual apps, although there's a limited, we have, there are various considerations around that. But yes, so 2 main pillars, I would say, in terms of Pledgeball. Firstly, increasing outreach, encouraging as many supporters groups, as many clubs, as many sports to take this on and use it to fit their community, and ensuring that then we're supporting those users, those Pledgeballers, those people who have joined our community in really driving this change.
It sounds really exciting. Lots of exciting kind of developments happening with Pledgeball. Similarly, on the side of research, Mark and Jenny, where is research at the moment, and what's happening moving forward in this space?
Well, I think as Katie alluded to, is sports at the beginning of its journey, and I think equally academics are. One of the reasons I got excited and got involved with this a couple of years ago is realizing that actually there isn't that much academic research in this space, and that's one of the things that I've sort of run with since I've come to Loughborough, which is about, okay, how do we start to mobilise the academic community in and around sport to actually take this matter seriously? And again, we keep mentioning it, but it's a big problem, and no one individual can fix it, and no one research area can fix it, and no one discipline can fix it. So it's requiring a variety of different ways of approaching it. And one thing at Loughborough is there are different groups of people, design school, or in working around sustainable pitches, or our sports science colleagues thinking about athletes running in the heat or in extreme conditions. So there's lots of different ways that sport needs to address this, but equally about the management of sport, the facilities, the recycling or upcycling of equipment and sports jerseys, to the social movement of athletes and fans actually wanting to speak about this. There's lots of different approaches, and there's only a dozen or so sort of people who've looked at this in the UK, with a few more in the US. So it's all at very sort of baby steps at the moment, but it's about the importance. As one thing I've worked out with Katie and Katie's highlighted as well, is it's the collaboration, it's the partnerships. We have to work. Say if I'm going to say we should be working with fans, we should also be working with national governing bodies, and working with clubs, and working with athletes, and working with people, various stakeholders. That it's we're all taking baby steps, but we all go in the right direction, in the same direction, rather than throwing our weight around and saying this is what needs to be done, because there is limited research in this space.
Whilst you say that, Mark, I mean, we definitely do need more case studies and all this, but I think also one thing that, I don't know, sport being rather late to this whole party, or not, it's not really a party, is it? But like sport joining this whole sustainability discourse and climate action discourse rather late, also means that there has been research done around particularly engaging people, engaging audiences on climate, which not necessarily has sports written all over it, but from what we can see so far, it can also be applied to sport communities. Because I mean, a football fan is not just a football fan. That person is also has different networks, part of different networks, has different identities and all these kind of things. So what I would definitely say, and I really do hope that, well, there's more and more organizations in sports, like Katie's organization, Pledgeball, for example, that engage with the existing research around particularly engagement on climate that is already out there. I mean, Climate Outreach has already been mentioned. They are a great organization. They've been around for many, many years, focusing especially on this. There's been a lot on how to make events more sustainable, even though it might not be sports events, but there is work being done. And I think, as I said, we're rather late to this now. So I think sport really can be the front runner in engaging with the existing research and just trying to not make the same mistakes that we've been making the last, 50, 60, 70 years. Just catch up and lead by example.
Thanks for that. Thanks for the summary there, and some really key points added there, Jenny. I really appreciate you all coming on and spending this time talking to us about this. From my brief summary, it does seem like you guys just mentioned how late sport is to this arena and how much in its infancy it is in terms of research. But if we go back and look at the power of football and the power of sport that you demonstrated earlier, that it's done in other areas to be agents of change, and kind of show how Pledgeball has this potential and has demonstrated research where actually football can make these changes. I really like the summary of Pledgeball, the simplicity of Pledgeball in the education side, and making those ideas come to life, making people commit to those changes, and to hopefully move it forward from individuals to communities to let's hit that 25% and kind of get this moving as a cultural change. I think it's very clear that this has huge potential, and I'm sure there's many other organizations out there trying to reach these kinds of groups like football fans, sports fans, to make wider change in society. It's been really, really interesting speaking to you, and I hope that this movement gets pushed forward and these kind of systemic changes can happen, because again, stealing from what other people have said before, it does now feel like we are beyond the 90th minute. We're in kind of extra time, as I think has been said by others in the past. But with football, there's always hope. And again, Mark's mentioned this in some of his research. We live as football fans with constant hope. 23 years Forest were outside the Premier League and we're back. Okay, how long for? Let's not talk about that. But there's always hope. We've all been there as football fans with hope. We now need to be part of this hope and part of this change. And we all now need to step forward. And, I'd love listeners to go on to your website, go on to Pledgeball and start making pledges, maybe picking up with their spectator groups. And like I've mentioned, Forest on your list. Let's hope that changes. Maybe I can try and speak to some people and get them on there, because otherwise it's pretty embarrassing that they're not. So all those people who can get involved and actually make those changes to get to this 25%, to get to this cultural change, is really where we need to stand. Really appreciate you coming on. Thank you for your time, and let's speak again in the future when things have moved forward.
Thanks for listening to the Experts in Sport podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, then please contact me, Martin Foster, at m.foster@loughborough.ac.uk. Thanks for listening. See you next time.